We've exhaustively covered the daily lives of clone troopers on this channel before, from how they were made, to how they spent their downtime, to what their sex lives were like. But what about their successors, the Imperial Stormtroopers? After all, the Stormtrooper Corps evolved from the Grand Army of the Republic, and the clones became the Empire's first Stormtroopers. Did the Empire treat its men differently than the Republic? In short, yes they did, and by and large, they treated them much worse. Imperial Stormtroopers had to live by a set of Draconian rules, and in this video, we'll be discussing all of them in detail. Today's video is sponsored by the team over at Blinkist. Now, Palpatine was a busy man drafting out all the rules for his new empire. Without being able to condense thousands of titles into 15-minute text and audio explainers called blinks, however, Palpatine just couldn't stay up to date on all the knowledge of the galaxy and eventually lost control. I maintain control of the empire of my mind by rereading and listening to key points of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and the Blockchain Revolution. If blinks aren't your style though, Blinkist offers full-length audiobooks for 65% off regular retail price, as well as condensed versions of podcasts called shortcasts. So make sure you don't end up like Palpatine and maintain your knowledge base, and head to blinkist.com/Geetsly for your 7-day free trial. Firstly, we should mention that there was some disparity between the treatment of clone stormtroopers and recruited stormtroopers. For example, recruits were paid, given leave, and allowed to lead lives outside of the Stormtrooper Corps, while clones were fully owned slaves of the Empire, just as they had been under the Republic. However, both clones and recruits were indoctrinated into the same ideology and forced to live under the same set of rules, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today. Stormtroopers were indoctrinated into what Leia Organa referred to as Stormtrooper ideology, an extreme version of the Empire's fascist New Order philosophy. Stormtrooper ideology was based on unwavering loyalty, unquestioning obedience, and total subservience to Emperor Palpatine. Like clones before them, Stormtroopers were taught not to think of themselves as individuals. However, while clones were taught to think of themselves and their brothers as pieces of a whole, Stormtroopers were taught to see themselves as mere extensions of the Emperor's will, and not even living beings. Stormtroopers were quite literally made to think of themselves as living droids, if even that. The rules that governed Stormtroopers' daily lives were largely meant to enforce this ideology, and that they were followed so well is a testament to the terrifying effectiveness of Imperial indoctrination. Ironically, Stormtroopers developed in almost the opposite way to clones. While clones were raised with these sorts of dehumanizing ideas and then gradually allowed to be more independent and individual thanks to the Jedi, the Stormtrooper Corps took independent individuals and completely messed them up. Stormtroopers were made to abandon as much of their sense of self as they could be made to. They were even made to effectively abandon their humanity, or rather their status as living beings. Stormtroopers were known to identify more with their armor, helmets, and numbers more than their skin, faces, and names, which is depressing and horrific. In one of the earlier episodes of Star Wars: The Bad Batch, Hunter remarked that the people under the Empire were lining up to be given numbers instead of names, in contrast to clones who claimed names for themselves after having been given only numbers. This phenomenon was taken to the extreme in the Stormtrooper Corps. While clone Stormtroopers kept the numbers they had been assigned at birth, new recruits into the Corps were assigned numbers after the fashion of their clone counterparts. All Stormtroopers, no matter whether they were clones or recruits, were expected to use these numbers instead of names at all times. Even one of the most trivial aspects of individual identity, the name, was forbidden for Stormtroopers. It may seem like a small thing, but the act of reducing people to serial numbers is a terribly powerful act, and an intensely dehumanizing one as well. Stormtrooper numbers were barely distinguishable from the numbers assigned to droids or even blaster models. To illustrate, let's try a little thought experiment. Of the numbers TK0, TK7, and TK426, how many do you think were actual numbers assigned to Stormtroopers? The answer is that only one of them was. The other two were the names of maintenance droids. The Stormtrooper Corps also had rules that regulated armor customization. These were also explicitly designed to suppress the individual. Anyone who's even remotely familiar with clone troopers knows that, during the Clone Wars, clones in the GAR customized their armor a lot. Clone units chose specific colors to paint on their armor, setting them apart from clones of other units, and most clones painted these stripes in unique patterns to further distinguish themselves. Clones added Karmas, pauldrons, rangefinders, or macro binoculars to their armor kits and drew symbols or even catchphrases on their helmets. Some of these choices served practical purposes, but for the most part, they were just matters of individual expression, something the Jedi encouraged. As we all know, all of this vanished under the Empire. Simply put, Stormtroopers weren't allowed to paint or otherwise customize their armor whatsoever. The rule was even enforced when it actively hampered troopers' combat effectiveness. For example, scout troopers weren't allowed to paint camouflage on their armor, even when wearing a bright white combat suit made them stick out like a sore thumb, which was most of the time. This was yet another control tactic. The Empire wanted its stormtroopers to look the same, both to civilians and to each other. Additionally, stormtroopers were only allowed to remove parts of their armor when they were back in their barracks or when injuries necessitated it, so as to keep them functionally identical for as long as possible. This was yet another way in which the Empire dehumanized its soldiers. To add to this, the Empire even required that stormtroopers look similar in some respects. To qualify for stormtrooper training, candidates had to fall within a narrow 2 cm height range and a similarly strict weight range. Stormtrooper armor was made in only one size. Yet again, this was all for the sole purpose of stopping stormtroopers from thinking as individuals. Once the Empire had purged all traces of individuality from its men, it replaced it with only one thing: unwavering loyalty to the Emperor. The will of Palpatine was the only purpose stormtroopers had in life, something they would gladly die for. They were trained to never question orders, no matter what they were, and that they should always accept that their orders were unquestionable and self-evidently right. In most stormtroopers, this indoctrination was so complete that they wouldn't even flinch when their close friends were killed in battle. So intense was their obedience and loyalty to the Emperor. We were going to call stormtroopers living droids again here, but in all honesty, we think that might be too light a term. Most droids had more humanity than what these pawns were left with. These dehumanizing rules were just intended to turn stormtroopers into willing tools of the Empire, however. We've mentioned a few times that we find this sort of dehumanization to be absolutely terrifying, and that was actually exactly what the Empire wanted. By turning people into fleshy machines, they gave their stormtroopers an important tactical advantage. A lot of beings were terrified of them, or at least uneasy around them. Remember, the Empire designed its military not to fight galactic scale wars, but to prevent galactic scale wars. Per the Tarkin doctrine, the Imperial military was basically engineered to scare potential rebels into abandoning all thoughts of rebellion. To quote Tarkin himself, "I maintain that the effectiveness of the Star Destroyer stems from not only its massive firepower, but from its size. When citizens look at a Star Destroyer and then compare it to the craft which might be mustered to attack it, they have a tendency to dismiss such a notion as suicidal rather than approach the problem tactically." While Star Destroyers were symbols of terror for the Imperial Navy, Stormtroopers were symbols of terror for Imperial ground forces. While Star Destroyers were unnerving because of their size, Stormtroopers were unnerving because of their inhumanity and uniformity. Deliberately, the Empire made it virtually impossible for enemies or civilians to distinguish between individual Stormtroopers. This, combined with how unrelenting and even suicidal Stormtroopers could be, meant that Stormtroopers seemed less like an army and more like a white wave in combat, with individual troopers as meaningless as drops of water in an ocean. This psychological effect alone could turn the tide of battles. The fact that this uniformity and inhumanity sometimes came with a tactical cost only strengthened the psychological effect. As we mentioned earlier, It was extremely impractical for Stormtroopers to wear all white, and yet they not only did so, but also worked hard to keep their armor as shiny as possible. The message it was supposed to convey was that Stormtroopers didn't need to hide from their enemies, that they were so certain in their ability to fight openly and win that they actually chose to stand out. So, those were the Draconian rules that governed the lives of Imperial Stormtroopers, and a bit of insight into why they were in place. But what do you think? Would you like to see more videos looking into the Empire? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.